Welcome back to another episode of the Web Design Show. In this video of the CSS course, we're diving deep into the world of CSS layouts with a focus on CSS Grid. But before we jump into CSS Grid, let's quickly recap the ever-popular Flexbox and understand how it differs from CSS Grid. These two layout systems have their unique strengths and use cases, allowing you to choose the perfect tool for every project. Flexbox is like a one-way street where you can arrange things in a row or column. It's good for aligning items. Grid is like a two-way street where you can arrange things in both rows and columns at the same time. It's great for building the overall layout of a page. If you want to create a complex design or have gaps between elements, and if you want to overlap items, you should use Grid. Flexbox, on the other hand, is more suitable for organizing the layout of a specific container and its direct child elements. It excels at vertically aligning items, horizontally aligning items, creating navigation menus, and building flexible content containers. So, if you want to align elements, use Flexbox. If you want to create the main structure of a page or overlap items, use Grid. You can choose between Flexbox and Grid or even combine them for the perfect design and functionality. Let's discuss the CSS Grid layout. In our HTML, I've created a parent container with the class Grid container and added child elements with class names like item1, item2, and so on. In the CSS file, we can easily set the container's display property to Grid without worrying about another CSS styling. By using the display Grid property on the container, we can unlock other Grid-related properties. One important property is Grid template columns, where we can specify the number and width of columns. By using the auto value 3 times, we create 3 columns. If we remove one auto value, it becomes 2 columns, and if we remove more, it becomes a single column. We can also specify the width of boxes, remove all auto, and set the width value to 120 pixels for the first column. Same for the second column, 250 pixels. For the third column, 70 pixels. Remove numbers and use auto for columns. To add space between columns, we can use the column gap property, setting it to 70 pixels, which adds space between each vertical column. Similarly, if we want to add space between rows, we can use the row gap property instead. To combine both column and row gaps, we can use the gap property, setting two values like 30 pixels and 120 pixels, where the first value is for the row gap and the second value is for the column gap. Before jumping to other properties, let's understand two things. First one is column lines and row lines. Column lines are vertical lines that start from line 1, line 2, and so on. Rows lines are horizontal lines that start from line 1, line 2, and so on. We have the grid column start and grid column end properties. For example, if we apply them to item 1 and set grid column start to 1 and grid column end to 3, it means item 1 spans from column line 1 to column line 3, and box 1 makes a big horizontal. Let's change the end value to 4, item will expand one column line to 4. Similarly, we can use grid row start and grid row end properties to specify the vertical range of an item, where item 1 can span from row line 1 to row line 3, box 1 makes big vertically. Let's change end value to 4 and the start value to 2. Item 1 will expand from row 2 and end at row 4. Next, we have the grid template rows property, which defines the height of each row in our grid. In our case, we have 3 rows, so we can provide 3 values such as 60 pixels for the first row, 120 pixels for the second row, and 200 pixels for the third row. Now, let's move forward and remove the grid template rows property. Instead, let's change the values of the grid template columns property and set them all to 100 pixels. Next, we have the justify content property, which allows us to align the grid inside the container. By setting it to space evenly, the columns will have an equal amount of space between and around them. If we use space around, it will behave similarly to space evenly. With space between the boxes of the first column and last column will align to the boundaries. The value center will align the boxes in the middle of the container. Next, we have the start option, which will align the items to the start of the container. On the other hand, using the value end will align the grid to the end of the container. We have covered horizontal alignment using the Justify Content property. Let's increase the height of the grid container to 500 pixels for a better demonstration. Now, if you need to align the grid vertically, you can use the Align Content property with the same values we discussed earlier. Space between. Space evenly. Center. Start. And end. These values allow you to control the vertical alignment of the grid within its container. Choose the appropriate value based on your design requirements to achieve the desired vertical alignment for your grid layout. In a grid container, we have grid items, which are the boxes inside the grid. By default, each column has one grid item in each row. But we can customize the grid items to occupy multiple columns or rows. Let's start by creating 6 columns using the Grid Template Columns property and setting it to auto 6 times. Now, let's focus on the first item. We can use the Grid Column property, which combines Grid Column Start and Grid Column End. Set it to 1/5, which means item 1 will start on column 1 and end before column 5. For the 6 value, item 1 will end at column line 6. Now let's move to the second item. This time, we'll set it to 2/6. It means item 2 will start on column line 2 and end at column line 6. We can also use the keyword span with the second number to define how many columns the item should span. Apply this to the other items by changing the class names. Now, remove the grid column. Let's discuss the grid row property, which is similar to grid column but works vertically for rows. It means the grid item will take the area of multiple rows depending on the value we provide. We will use it for the first item. Set it to 1/3, which means item 1 will start on row 1 and end before row 3. Now let's move on to the next property, which is the grid area. First, select item 5 and set its value to 1/3/6/7. This property serves as a shorthand for grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, and grid column end properties. The first value represents grid row start, the second value represents grid column start, the third value represents grid row end, and the fourth value represents grid column end. Now let's change these values. By changing the first value, it decides the grid row start. Let's change the second value, it specifies the grid column start. The third value represents the grid row end. Fourth value specifies the grid column end. Now let's apply this to other items by changing the class names. Let's update the grid area values. If you found this video helpful, I kindly request your support by liking the video, subscribing to my channel, activating the notification bell for future video updates,